Hello, everyone. Michael here. I'm going to depart a little bit from normal videos that I do. I normally do videos on investing and international structuring and business, things that apply to kind of my field of work. But I decided today, I was sitting down a couple days ago to write a fairly lengthy post article, which I may still finish off and publish, about the subject of self-terminating societies or self-terminating species such as our own, and kind of the existential threat that is potentially posed to our planet, but more specifically to humans. And this was inspired a little bit from a conversation that I had with my wife, Tiana. We were talking based on a course she was taking through Harvard about the nature of climate change and problems with overconsumption in the world. And I kind of decided to put this together because A, it would be easier to record a video, and also because of the fact that I thought I've just seen some more things popping up. There's a Michael Moore film called Planet of Humans, and I, mostly don't give any credence to what Michael Moore has to say. He maybe has, a few little good points now and then, but I consider him to have no journalistic integrity, no documentary integrity, and he, spins things to be controversial. He's good at that. But I would never trust him as an authority. What's much more interesting is I finished watching, it's about a 3 hour interview discussion between Eric Weinstein and Daniel, I can't remember his last name, but if you want to go and check out Eric's podcast, it's on YouTube, episode 29 of The Portal. And in this he was discussing basically this concern that humans are going to wipe ourselves out. And it's pretty inevitable. And how is it that we get out of that mess? And one of the things that I love about Eric and The Portal is they're very deep, nuanced conversations. They're not surface level things. And so it was really wonderful just to kind of hear them break down the thought process, to have this dialogue back and forth between the two of them as Eric would pose questions and have some challenges to some of the suggestions that Daniel had come up with over many, many years of thinking deeply on the problem. And it is, at a big picture, if you think about, okay, the death of our species is perhaps the greatest threat. And I've been saying for a while now that, in my opinion, this is the last century of, or not the last century, but perhaps the most significant century of human existence ever. Okay? So in approximately, I say a century, but maybe it turns out to be 200 years. Maybe it, who knows exactly when it started. But I'll give a little bit of background context, okay? Which is, so the human race became humans in one shape or form, I don't know, a few million years ago, depending on where you define that starting point. And really, we didn't have a serious species-level existential threat, meaning humanity would be wiped out, for most of our history. And the reason for this is simply because of the fact that, or at least not a high probability one, okay? So, of course, just similar effects that killed the dinosaurs could wipe out humans throughout much of our history. Primarily, we're looking at two causes. One is, an asteroid could hit the world and, wipe us out. Or you could have mass eruptions of volcanoes all more or less simultaneously around the world, and that could create an event that could wipe us out. But we were pretty much safe as a species because of geographic distribution. Okay, so after there was, maybe a small number of humans and they spread out, in that early stage, as a species, we're very, very vulnerable, right? Because obviously, in a lot of regards, we're not that well adapted. Supposedly we came from scavengers, or mammals in general, I guess, came from scavengers. And, so there's certain characteristics that go along with that. As we spread out, though, the ability of disease, okay, disease could spread, but it wasn't going to kill probably everybody. You could have war, but it wouldn't kill everybody. You could have, some sort of pestilence, some sort of famine, some sort of, climate issue. You could have some sort of whatever. And these were not significant enough to affect us on a global basis. So for certainly the last, 20,000 plus years, we've been in a situation where our species as a whole has not been threatened. You could have mass extinction in certain areas. You have the collapse of civilizations. You could have millions and millions of people killed, probably most significantly the Black Death. But it wasn't going to wipe us out as a species. And that arguably changed starting in 1945 with the atomic bomb. right? The atomic bomb was the start of the first time that we could potentially wipe ourselves out. Especially exasperated by the Soviets getting it and the development of the hydrogen bomb. Then you suddenly had this massive armament, and who knows exactly, how many bombs it would take in order to cause a nuclear winter that would wipe out humanity, and whether, there'd be a possibility to go and hide in bunkers. There's some arguments that you could make that we could have survived, but it would be, drastically bad. In a similar sense, if you look at climate change today, almost no projection, I would say no reasonable projection, demonstrates a situation in which we are likely to be wiped out entirely. There's certainly the possibility that life changes drastically, that many people die, that, you're in a situation where quality of life decreases across the planet, things like this, but unlikely that we wipe ourselves out. That being said, it is certainly possible, if we were to push it far enough and break down certain aspects of the ecosystem in which we rely, that this could happen. More importantly, I think, are two other factors that have added to the equation. So basically we've got 6 factors, in my view, from what I can see, that are potential existential threats. One is, asteroid hitting the Earth, which is pretty low probability in any given year, but over, millions of years is an issue. Obviously, if you go a long enough timeline, then, the sun is going to become a red giant, and, the Earth is going to be no more, basically. But, we're talking the next 10 millennia, let's say, our chances of being wiped out, won't be that, right? So the volcanoes thing is a possibility still. Again, very low probability event, right? The likelihood that it happens over the course of billions of years, high probability, but over any given 10,000 year period, very, very low. This climate change thing is high probability, right? Obviously there's some sort of effect, and you can get into a whole discussion about that, which is not the purpose of this video. It's very low likelihood that that's going to be so significant as to wipe us out, but you never know if we're totally unrestrained and insane, and this will kind of get into this self-terminating idea. That could maybe happen. Nuclear war is a really interesting one we'll get into because of the fact that it's kind of a mystery, or a bit of luck, why we haven't already done that, right? And that's going to become an increasing threat as we go forward. So that's another piece. The next piece is, kind of timely, because I'm sitting here in quarantine in Bulgaria, and, it's the idea of some sort of a pandemic. Now, a pandemic is not in itself, a natural one is not likely to wipe us out. What's changing and what is significant is our ability to edit genes and manufacture, organisms. In that environment, we could create self-adapting, replicating, bacteria, viruses, whatever, that could potentially wipe us out. And that would be, obviously catastrophic, right? And the other one that's a significant concern, perhaps along with nuclear power or nuclear weapons, the biggest threat is artificial intelligence, okay? And the interesting thing with artificial intelligence is artificial intelligence does not need to be malicious in order to wipe us out. So the very classic case that people will say is they'll say, okay, what if you have a device, a machine, some sort of AI, whose sole purpose is to manufacture paper clips. And it has 2 characteristics. One is that it can improve at how well it does at this, and the second is, so it's kind of it's not just self-learning, it can improve on its own ability to learn, right? Which can lead to this exponential growth in its capability, which is concerning. The second is, it's obsessed with producing paper clips. And what might happen is you didn't build it in the right way, and so it gets so obsessed with building these paper clips that it views everything else as a threat, and it just starts deconstructing everything around it. And if you try to shut it down, you become a threat, and it takes you out, and just, continually turns everything into paper clips, right? So that's kind of a horror scenario that shows that it doesn't need to be malicious, it doesn't need to be sentient, and yet AI could wipe us out. And, basically the idea of all of this is, if you have exponential technology, meaning technology that can continuously improve, you run into a huge problem, okay? So the reason I say this is kind of like the most crucial century is two factors, in my view, will have a major impact in potentially protecting us from this. Okay? The first of these is we will likely become an interplanetary species in some form over the next 100 years or so. So obviously Elon Musk is the main proponent of going to Mars. I think that the idea of colonizing Mars is probably not a really great idea, and it will probably be the only planet that we colonize if we ever colonize another planet. And the reason is simply that the costs of terraforming Mars are so large and the process takes so long that I believe in the long term, if we go into space and we become, an interplanetary and an intersolar system type species, we would do that by building giant space colonies, as well as possibly altering the nature of life, which is a whole other thing that I'm going to discuss later on, because I have a different view from a lot of what is out there. And I think it's worth discussing that view. I think, the point that Eric Weinstein in the video made was he said, hey, given the gravity of this problem, it is surprising that multidisciplinary experts are not putting more energy into thinking about this problem. But anyway, the whole point is, if we can expand beyond the Earth, right, whether it's into space colonies, whether it's to Mars, whether it's something like that, then our ability to survive, certainly the nuclear environment, is much, much greater, and potentially the biological warfare environment as well, and potentially the idea of taking out, the environment in some way, shape, or form. Okay. The second piece is artificial intelligence. Now, AI, I think, has kind of three potential paths that it can take, and we don't know how long it will take to get there. It could turn out that it is much more challenging to solve than we think, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute as well. But of these three paths, eventually, given time, I think there's binary options, right? The one is, hey, listen, it's very helpful for us, and it becomes the greatest advantage to our existence in existence. The other one is it either advertently or inadvertently wipes us out, okay? We cease to exist. The third one, which I think speaks more to kind of the consciousness of AI, is the idea that it would be agnostic to us. So, in my opinion, if you follow a natural trajectory of the theories of AI, if you were to get to a place where you had artificial general intelligence, and let's speak about this right now. Okay, let's talk about the fact that right now, if you look at kind of the thought around artificial intelligence, there is artificial narrow intelligence, which is what we have right now, right? Meaning that it's some sort of technology designed to do a very specific thing, okay? And that, remember, could wipe us out. That's, I think, one of the things that a lot of people don't get. A lot of people seem to think, hey, you have to reach the singularity, the point like in Terminator, where AI becomes aware of itself and so on and so forth. I don't think that's necessary. I think if you have extremely sophisticated but uncontrolled artificial narrow intelligence, that narrow intelligence could wipe us out, which is dangerous, right? The second is artificial general intelligence. This is where the AI is more like a human, so it has the ability to think about multiple domains. And we're seeing early signs of something a little bit like that with AlphaZero, which AlphaZero is a Google DeepMind project which has done Go, chess, and the Japanese version of Go, or whatever it's called. Anyway, shogi or something like that. Anyway, so we're starting to see a little bit of that. Now, there are theories that we will reach artificial general intelligence sometime around 2050, and the way they figure this out is by assuming exponential growth in here. Now, I've done a video, I haven't posted it yet, but it was a kind of a discussion around the subject. I was talking about with my friend Christopher Peel, and he was projecting out that by the end of April we were going to have 15 million confirmed cases of corona, and I argued that that was grossly overstated. My estimate was more like 4 or 5 million. It turns out we came in at around 3. But the argument that he was making was, hey, people aren't accounting for the exponential growth, and the argument I was making was that exponential growth really isn't exponential. Okay, so you see these arguments of this, extreme rise, but what happens in practice is you run into limitations. You have either physical constraints or intervention, which is basically what we've seen in the case of corona, right? So similarly, when you talk about artificial intelligence, yes, you get these exponential growth periods, right? But it could well be that we exhaust the limits of our perspective on it. So if you look at the more recent advances in artificial intelligence, they've largely been driven by diving into deep neural nets and going, and you can, there's lots, the science of artificial intelligence can get pretty deep and insane. So we're not going to go into that, but just let's say deep neural nets. And there was some great insights with respect to Markov blankets and how they kind of adjust the perspective that you might take on how to address this. To me, that was when I read a paper or a lengthy article on this insight around Markov blankets and what's called free energy, the reduction and minimization of free energy in order to prevent or reduce entropy. It was big insight for me in terms of human behavior, in terms of many things. So very, very cool subject. That being said, I'm going to take a drink. This is going to be a long video, so. That being said, we don't know at what point these ideas hit a plateau, and it's possible that the trajectory that we're on will not lead us to artificial general intelligence. Now you go from there to artificial superintelligence. I'm not so clear on what the distinction is between artificial general intelligence and artificial superintelligence, but as I understand it, it's basically, well, all these AI are talking to each other, acting as one mastermind, and they have access to, really all the information in the world via the internet, right? So that would be a very, very dangerous place to be. And a lot of people don't really appreciate that if you get an AI that can self-improve and has massive power and starts to understand itself and its own working and develops its own theories about how AI works and then improves on those theories, you can have an AI that, is like the intelligence of a 2-year-old in the morning, and you think, oh, that's very cute, and by evening it's Einstein, and by tomorrow it's, a planet of Einsteins, right? And it gets very rapidly to this place where it's totally out of control and totally beyond anything that we have. We are literally totally meaningless to it, okay? And this is, I think if you follow that thought process through, what you're likely to find is that AI would likely be agnostic to people, much like we are more or less agnostic to ants, right? So we'll see. We don't know what will happen there, but I think that uncertainty comes with an enormous degree of risk. And so because of that, it's something that's worth thinking about. So now going back to the argument of how we are, self-terminating, is that when you have this technology, whether you're talking about that technology or nuclear technology or biological technology, what increasingly happens is the impact of that technology goes up, which is what we've seen with nuclear weapons, right? But what's worse is that the distribution of that technology becomes much greater. So if you look at the fact that we haven't had nuclear war over, since 1945 until the present, we're in 2020 right now, you might say probabilistically, like every year there's a certain probability, and it's not necessarily the same every year, but a certain probability that you're going to have that kind of war. And when you had two superpowers that more or less controlled this technology and could kind of observe each other and build mutually assured destruction, there was an incentive as well as a structure that it was less likely to happen, right? But as it becomes more and more easy, more and more accessible for more and more people to have that kind of power, if you have 1 million of them, then the probability is someone's going to use it, right? Now, okay, we know that you can have nuclear disasters and it doesn't wipe out the species, doesn't wipe out the planet, so, does that wipe out humanity? Does that create a chain reaction, a trigger event of, whatever? We're not sure, right? We're not sure. But there is certainly a risk. And the more people can do this, the riskier it becomes. As you get into genetic modifications, if I have the ability to create new species of bacteria, create new viruses, all kinds of things from my home on my computer with no restrictions, I mean, you've got almost 8 billion people on the planet right now. We'll have probably 10 billion or so by 2100. When you reach that stage, it's like, whoa, hang on a second here. Somebody's going to do it, right? Somebody will do it. And so inevitably, we end up in a case where if many people can cause existential level damage, and whether that happens this year or it happens in 10 years or it happens in 10,000 years isn't really the point. The point is eventually you just reach that stage, it becomes an issue, right? So the argument from Eric Weinstein is, hey, you basically need to have the escape plan, which is, hey, you have a way of going so far away to another solar system or something that these two are not connected. I don't know that that's a particularly persuasive argument to me. I think obviously if you can distribute it across enough points, then any one of those points, there's no single point of failure. But I think there's a reasonable possibility that the same self-termination happens in multiple points and wipes each other out. So the argument that Daniel was making in this was we need some sort of a consciousness change. And what he pointed out was we have a limited ecosystem, and in this limited ecosystem you've got two problems simultaneously, right? This kind of comes to what Tiana and I were talking about. The first is you have a limited supply of resources that you're consuming, okay? And as you consume those, you're creating deficits within the ecosystem, right? At the same time, you have waste products, and those waste products are also building up, creating challenges within the ecosystem. So the idea is, okay, we need to readjust our economy into some sort of a closed loop system where what we consume, we basically are able to recycle our waste products into consumption. And we can't do that. We can do it with a limitation on atoms, but not necessarily energy. So we probably end up using, initially some form of solar power, maybe nuclear, and eventually, hopefully, fusion. And then, whatever is beyond that. So that way, we could have more and more energy, and we could create more and more complexity, which could improve the quality of life in some respects, while at the same time not being in a situation that we're just over-consuming resources on the planet. Now, this does arguably require the human population stabilizing, and there's some reason to believe that that will happen. Okay, so this is another example where exponential growth doesn't continue exponentially. The human population is stabilizing. Okay, if you look at birth rates, global birth rates are now down to, I believe it's around 2.5 or something like that. Replacement is 2.1. The projections are that by 2021, there will be no more children born than there are born today. Okay, sorry, not 2021. 2100, sorry. By the year 2100, the number of births today will be the same as the number of births then. The population will have grown because you have basically, it fills out, right? So there's more children today than there are adults today. And so as those people age, basically you have 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 20 to 60, etc. Now, where that does break down to some extent is we also are probably going to extend lifespans, and so we could continue to have a growing population. Now, right now, lifespans have kind of flattened more or less. In some places, they're going down a little bit for the first time. So whether that happens or not, interesting question, right? There is a reasonable possibility that, we could either expand, and I think it's almost inevitable that the pressures and human ingenuity and drive lead us to be interplanetary, and that helps to deal with some of this problem, okay? So we eliminate some of our resource constraints. We also, I think, have a tremendous ability to work better with the resources that we have, and that's one of the things I want to get into primarily as a point. So I'm giving you this lengthy preamble to get to this place where you can discuss what is, I think a pretty important and interesting topic. I'm not going to go through Daniel's explanation. He has, the reasons that he believes that we can have sort of a consciousness change, and I think it's an interesting argument. I think it's worth going and watching that interview. But I'm going to focus on a different path, which they would consider to be naively optimistic, but I'm not sure that that's the case. So I'm going to present that. So the argument that Tiana made was, hey, look, you have this problem with all this waste, and what do you do about that? And I just look at it and I'm like, okay, well, let's start by talking about energy as a simple example, okay? Because I think the energy can serve as a proxy for many other things. So first of all, so her argument was, well, in order for everybody to have the same quality of life as the most affluent countries do today, it would put too much strain on our environment, and our environment would break down. Okay, fair enough. The argument that I would make, and so therefore you need to limit the population, you need to reduce it down. This is more or less the argument made in Planet of Humans. Planet of Humans essentially says, we need to reduce the population, have population control, and reduced consumption. Okay, I don't think that this is necessarily true. I think there's a lot of things that are changing today in the world that have not been true historically. And if you keep that trajectory going forward and you kind of look out into what the world looks like, I think there's a bunch of things that people are maybe underestimating the impact of that will have profound influences, okay? I do think that there are, as Eric would say, embedded growth obligations in the system that are not sustainable. I wrote a Facebook post recently about how the biggest challenge in the world today is scale, and how things that work on the small scale don't scale to the big scale, and we have to fundamentally, as a society, as civilization, as humanity, we need to work that out. You need to start with that assumption that what works on the small scale doesn't work on the large scale, and therefore you need to apply a different set of rules to large scale problems than you do to small scale problems. And that radically readjusts society in a way that, will probably over the long term be very healthy. But it requires a rethinking of a lot of our assumptions and a lot of the organization of our systems and how we do things. And so it's a pretty major challenge. Okay, so let's talk about this, going back to the subject of what's going on here. So we're going to use energy consumption, in particular vehicles, as an example. Okay, so vehicles, burn fossil fuels. Now, what's the problem with this? The problem is we have a limited amount of fossil fuels. And yes, some people will make arguments that, there is hundreds of years of reserves and so on and so forth. On a long enough time span, it really doesn't matter. The point is that your fossil fuels are going to go to zero, okay? At the same time, your cost of extraction and your competition, as more and more people demand that power, is going to grow. This kind of comes to the peak oil theory, right? And you run into this problem where eventually the cost goes up, right? This is a very good thing. It's a very, very good thing that the cost of energy from fossil fuels will go up dramatically. And because that will essentially force us into other alternatives. And so that's the first thing, right? Is you're running out of these, and that's a challenge to our way of life over the long period of time. Not a short period of time, not 100 years, probably, but over 1,000 years, almost certainly. Okay. The next side of it is, well, in the process, you have this waste output in the form of, in this particular case, emissions, right? But this is an abstraction that we're using. I mean, if you're using birth control pills and flushing them into the rivers, if you get enough of them, it adds up to a problem. If you have pollution, you're throwing plastic in the ocean, enough of it causes a problem. If you have, too much cattle, enough of the, waste products of the cattle causes a problem. If you get any of these, as soon as you have this exponential growth scenario, at some point the ecosystem cannot handle it anymore. And so you need to somehow either expand your resource base, and you can increase your efficiency to some extent, right? Actually, I think probably to a much greater extent than people think, but at some point you still have to limit it, or you need to expand your resource base, okay? And primarily by expanding to other planets. And there's whole arguments that you can make. There's an interesting book called Manifold Time, where it's a fiction book, but they pose this interesting perspective that implies that the human race is likely to go to near zero. And I think there's lots of reason probabilistically to believe that would be the most likely future, but it's a far from inevitable future is what I would say, which is why it's worth having these conversations. Okay, so fair enough. We've got this extreme environment where we're consuming this. Well, you can already see the trend that we're moving to electrical vehicles. Okay, electrical vehicles mean that not only do we not have this limited resource problem in terms of consuming fossil fuels, but we also don't have the problem associated with output of exhaust, right? So yes, you can say, okay, as you get more vehicles, you have to dispose of batteries, the truth is, that's much less our problem in the short run, okay? Over the long period of time, yes, that's an issue. The good news is that over the long term, our ability to drive our energy costs down using things like solar are pretty great. So if you look today, it depends on where you are and what technology and things like this, but the cost of solar has about come in line with the cost of, say, fossil fuel-based technologies, natural gas, coal, things like this. And it's unlikely that we're going to see any sort of a profound reduction in the price of fossil fuel-based energy. But it is highly likely that we can reduce the cost of solar power by probably an order of magnitude, probably a factor of 10. It's entirely possible we can get down much lower than that. Right now, we're seeing a very rapid decline, an exponential reduction in the cost of solar panels over time. But it goes even beyond the cost of solar panels, because you can say, okay, what is the efficiency of solar panels and what's the lifespan? So if you just kind of look at the basic equation, the cost that you have of any form of power is broken into more or less three parts: the capital cost to set it up, the maintenance cost to manage it, and then the fuel cost, right? Solar energy has no fuel cost, right? So that's very good. So you have a capital cost, you have a maintenance cost. The maintenance cost can arguably be reduced dramatically lower than most fossil fuel technologies because moving parts are a big problem when it comes to maintenance. And the capital costs, you're going to have the capital costs. However, there's a good chance that you can lower the capital costs in many regards, potentially dramatically, through solar power. Now, you do run into battery issues and all this, and they're working on those problems. So the bottom line is that if you eliminate the fuel cost and you stretch out the lifespan of those panels, right, because pretty much the equation that you have is you say, okay, the capital cost multiplied by the efficiency divided by the life cycle, or divided over the life cycle, rather, determines the cost of energy, right? Now, of course, you've got the cost of capital in order to provide that initial capital purchase cost. But, you know, you can kind of strip that down to the basic physics as well, and you can say, okay, well, what are the basic components? How low can we get those component costs? And you can see kind of where the theoretical minimum is on that. And what starts to happen at a certain point is you can use that lower cost power to drive your costs down on producing that power by reducing your manufacturing costs, and that has kind of a bit of a virtuous cycle to it. It goes a certain distance. It doesn't go forever, but it goes a certain distance. So simply by increasing the lifespan of a solar panel, say from 20 years to 60 years, you've basically cut your cost of power more or less into three, right? Because once you've recouped your capital cost, the power is free, right? So that's, you know, pretty good. Again, you do have, you know, some time value of money cost on that capital in order to, you know, buy the solar panels, etc. But still, it's a big deal. So if you just kind of look at that, if you look at where the efficiency of solar panels are, where we know based on lab tests we can get the efficiency to, etc., we can more than double, probably triple the efficiency of solar panels. We can drive the cost of solar panels down lots, and we can extend the lifespan of solar panels lots. So if you just factor in all those things, as well as the potential efficiencies that come from being able to produce power locally rather than at a distance and then needing to send the power out on power cables, which, you know, lose power, you again increase the efficiency. This is very useful. Again, the battery thing is something that we're working on. Batteries or some other form of storage, right? So, you know, you could pump water into towers and then drain it at night. You could, you know, there's lots of different ways that you can potentially store energy, and you just have to be able to do that for low enough cost, at large enough scale, with enough efficiency to make it work, okay? And, you know, maybe there's hydrogen as part of that blend. There's lots of different things that you could put into the blend. But the bottom line is, it's very optimistic that we can get the cost of power down dramatically, which is very good for people in particular in, you know, the third world, right? If you go to Africa, India, places like this, being able to get the cost of power reduced by a factor of 10 is very, very good for their societies. And so this is a positive thing. And why I view this as positive, some people say, hey, look, you know, you want to have population control, population reduction. I think, you know, the fundamental value in the world is human capital and human innovation. And if you have, you know, 8 billion people working on educating themselves and solving problems, this has an inherent advantage over if you have, you know, 1 billion people working on the same problems, etc. Okay? And I think that is probably more than a factor of 8 in that particular example, because of the fact that you get cross-pollination of ideas which accelerate the development of those ideas. If you go and you look at any society which has been highly isolated has remained primitive. Okay? You can go, there's a great book called Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Thomas Sowell, where he kind of goes through an explanation of the importance of interaction between people and interaction between societies in order to advance. All right, so that hopefully gives you a bit of a baseline, a bit of a concept here worth exploring. What's next? Well, now we can start to say you could apply the same principle, especially when you have cheap energy. You can start to recycle materials much more efficiently. But the next thing that happens that becomes very significant is increasingly we're dematerializing. So a simple example of this is look at the consumption of digital media. Okay, so today you watch Netflix, you download things off iTunes, etc. It used to be you would go and buy video cassettes. Well, that video cassette became a form of pollution, right? First of all, there was a lot more production cost that went in there. You had to transport it, you had to store it, you had to worry about it being stolen, you had to have people staffing there, etc. The supply chain cost of that videotape was extremely high, both in terms of the production, the management, and the disposal, okay? Today, you basically have, it's just pure energy, okay? And as we drive down the cost of energy and improve our computing power, improve our bandwidth, etc., you're in a very, very good position. So we're going to have a lot more things dematerializing over time. The biggest factor here that is going to probably make a difference, because you're going to have certain constraints, right? There are certain things that are almost inherently scarce. These are, big landmarks, like, you go to the Eiffel Tower, you go to, Barcelona, you visit Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. Any of these sorts of things, there's only one of them, right? And so there is demand for more and more people to go to those things. But if you can give a thoroughly immersive virtual reality experience, you can maybe eliminate a lot of that. And, we'll see what the progress of VR is over the coming 100 years, but there's a very good reason to believe that we will be able to have extremely high fidelity, hyper immersive VR at some point in time. Now, how well we're able to interact with the brain and the body, that'll be an interesting question, but you'll be able to get a lot of that experience without the need to travel. Again, if we can convert atoms to bits, then you end up in a situation where our consumption goes way down, but our quality of life, in a certain abstract sense, can go way up. And so I've got, a couple science fiction books that I've been wanting to write for quite a bit of time, and the one is based on this idea of people all living in virtual reality, kind of a Matrix-style thing. And look, if you just follow through this course of thinking and say, hey, look, we're self-terminating, etc., this is a logical out, well, that's one of many reasons to believe that we are already living in that. Are we? Who knows, right? Who knows? But that's an interesting possibility. The second side of it, which I think is equally important, comes down to the discussion Daniel makes. So Daniel has this idea of we need to end up in a situation where we're non-rivalrous, okay? We need to have non-rivalrous exchange of goods, production, etc., because right now our system is kind of inherently rivalrous. And that's largely built around the idea of scarcity. Now you've got certain kind of abundance economics people who will discuss this, but there are certain things that simply become scarce. Now, as I said, some of it you can get rid of through things such as virtual reality, right? And I think to underestimate the impact of virtual reality on society over, if you can get through, I don't know what it is, 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, how long that time frame is, who knows, right? But if you can get through there, that has a radically significant change to our consumption equation. At the same time, you still potentially have rivalrous dynamics, in large part due to attention. So attention right now, and I'm going to do a blog post or a Facebook post or something about what I call the new rules of success because of this. Attention is a scarce resource that we're competing for. It is arguably one of the most valuable resources on the planet today. And because of that, you have this rivalry, right? You have this competition between influencers, etc. Well, how do we get around that problem, right? And I think the answer to that comes from the fact that the very nature of what it is to be human is going to change over the next probably 100 years. How is that going to happen? Well, number one, we're going to have very good genetic engineering, hopefully, right? That is going to allow us to change ourselves in many ways, I have brown eyes, maybe I can make my eyes whatever color I want, okay? You could make people be able to live longer, of course. You could change their dynamics. They can be bigger, faster, stronger, shorter, whatever it is that you'll have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you adapt people physically. And this is going to lead to people who probably do not look like people over, whatever time period is that, 100 or 500 years, somewhere in that range. You're going to get people who, simply based on genetic engineering, are no longer like each other. And also, that is likely to have an impact where we are far less likely to be able to reproduce directly, because of the fact that you can kind of see, like as an example, species are too different to be able to reproduce. Maybe you can have like a liger form of a tiger and a lion, but then ligers can't reproduce, right? So there's a reasonable possibility that we could end up in a scenario where we cannot reproduce anymore. And if you combine that with virtual reality, this gives a very different population equation, even if we have an aging population, even if we solve the aging equation, even if we're in a situation where, okay, we can live potentially forever in youth, which, is one of my biggest hopes. we're going to be in a situation where potentially the procreation that happens quote unquote naturally drops to zero or near zero. Okay, obviously you're going to have some deaths due to accidents, etc. So, but you'll probably be able to grow people in petri dishes, and so that will counteract. In addition to how the nature of people will change based on genetics, because it doesn't solve our non-rivalrous nature, is you're going to have cyborgs, right? You're going to have increasing ability to have, maybe you have a robotic hand, maybe you have, who knows what. Well, one of the big things is going to be integration of computers into your brain. One of the arguments that Daniel makes is there's something called the Dunbar number. The Dunbar number is essentially that there are a limit to how many social interactions you can have, and whether it's, some people say 150, 200, whatever the number is, doesn't really matter. The point is you can only know so many people personally, and you have a certain degree of empathy for them, and he has a lengthy explanation for what he thinks is important in this regard. That being said, I think that you can get around a lot of that with technology, because what happens when your brain is kind of like what they're doing with Neuralink, able to integrate with the computer. Now you can directly interact with other people, and you can have a form of empathy with everyone, as well as a form of coordination with everyone that enables you to solve many of the rivalrous dynamics that exist. Okay, and I think Daniel has some really great thoughts on this subject, so I think it's worth going and looking at what he talks about in terms of building a non-rivalrous society. But I look at it more from a technology standpoint. I'm a bit more of a technologist. And I think that these technologies, many of them are not that far away, right? On the horizon of the next 100 years, it's probably reasonable that we can develop a bunch of this stuff. Now, like I said, artificial intelligence may be a much harder problem to solve than we think. Interacting with the brain may be a much harder problem to solve than we think. Fully immersive, high-fidelity VR may be a much harder problem to solve than we think. However, that being said, on a large enough time frame, we kind of inevitably get there. I think the genetic engineering is much more viable, and our ability to adjust ourselves. One of the things that I argue about, part of why we would never terraform another planet aside from Mars, is because it reaches a certain point where it's easier to modify us than it is to modify a planet. And so, we would send robots, or we would make ourselves kind of semi-robotic, etc. And this is a very interesting situation. I think to some extent, some of this equation around the human capital and the values that come from that help to explain why we haven't had a nuclear war at this point in time. And I think that is also factored into another reason why we're likely to become less rivalrous as a society and more likely to sustain ourselves over the long period of time. And this has to do with resource consumption, right? So historically, a lot of wars were fought over oil, over land, fundamentally, right? Historically, if you look back, land was power, and we fought for land. Then we kind of adapted that, factories, etc., became power, and it became less valuable to accumulate land, but it was still valuable, right? Well, today, the real value comes from human potential, human capital, human ingenuity, and you cannot force people to be innovative, right? That dynamic, that type of societal structure does not work. And if you take that forward, you say, well, the incentive to go and wipe out billions of people when those billions of people are fueling my innovation engine are a lot less. So yes, if there becomes a resource constraint and they're over-consuming, then there becomes a need for, some sort of rivalry in order to address that resource constraint, right? But there's a reasonable possibility that as we digitize more and more things, our resource constraints become less and less of an issue. And as we have less and less of an issue in terms of resource constraints, we end up with more and more of a situation where the value of people is greater than the loss of people, and we can go through this. Now, you're still going to have the 0.001% outliers, and those 0.001% outliers are going to be in a situation where you say, okay, well, they could do something catastrophic, and that's why we have to address these catastrophic risks. So how do we do that? Well, potentially we put them into VR, right? It's like, great, you can go and experiment and do catastrophic things, but you're not doing it outside of a controlled environment. And now your ingenuity is applied in ways that basically it can take place internally in this environment, and then it can be harnessed externally. And you've got some of this. you also end up in a situation where artificial intelligence is able to hopefully intervene for us, right? Which is why I say we either make artificial intelligence work for us and it protects us and it solves lots of problems and we end up as a very prosperous society, or it goes the other way and we wipe ourselves out, right? And this kind of brings to, I think, kind of the last point that I want to discuss, which is the Fermi paradox, okay? So, for those who aren't familiar, the Fermi paradox basically states that we as, or that, any species throughout the universe, if it was to kind of follow the idea of evolutionary growth, is eventually supposedly going to reach a point, unless it's self-terminating, that it expands to other planets, okay? And if you follow this through, okay, what you can start doing is leapfrogging this society, right? So imagine that we were us, and we reach the point where first we can go to Mars, then we can go to Alpha Centauri, we maybe colonize some planets there, we have our space colonies, etc. Then we spread out from Alpha Centauri and our solar system to the next solar system. So Alpha Centauri, it's 1,000 light years away, right? It's a long ways away from where we are today. It would take, it would be difficult to get there. Virtually based on our current technological outlook, we'll never get there. But if you assume a very long time frame, then it's not a problem to get there, okay? And so the guesstimate is, I think it would take about 25 million years to colonize the galaxy. And because of that, the galaxy should already be colonized, because we're talking about, the Earth is like 4 billion years old, 4.5 billion years or whatever. So the Fermi paradox is, hang on, where are all the aliens? The aliens should be here. If there's not something built into kind of our makeup that we self-terminate, then the aliens should be here. Where are they? We see no signs anywhere of these aliens. Yeah, okay, you can get into, some of the UFO explanations, etc. But by and large, there's nothing too credible on that. That's a bit of an issue, right? You think, okay, well, this implies to us that we must be self-terminating, and and maybe it's an extraordinarily low probability event, but again, you just kind of extrapolate these probabilities, right? Across the entire galaxy, you have, theoretically, many, many, many stars which could have a planet, possibly multiple, where life could develop, and life should develop on those given a long enough time frame. And then that life should eventually, even if some of it self-terminates, some of it eventually is going to reach the stage where it can expand out, and so on and so forth. So on this gross, huge, cosmic timeline, we should have aliens, okay? And so here's kind of the counter-argument to that, which is, what is to say that we don't have aliens? And I don't mean this in a, UFO, Roswell. I went to Roswell. It's a very interesting place. But not that sense. I think the fundamental assumption that aliens would take a form similar to humans, or similar to any life on our planet, is a poor assumption. Now, there is something called Gaia theory that they can use to kind of look for life on other planets by examining the ecosystem and how we'd affect the ecosystem and kind of maintain this kind of stasis. So we haven't found life based on that at this point in time. But just think about if the things that aliens 25 million years ahead of us would know that we don't know. Our civilizations may be around 10,000 years, right? Depending on when you look at the start of civilization. And look at how far we've progressed. We'll now extrapolate that to 25 million years, right? We're talking about over 1,000 times. It's hard to fathom what it is that you would talk about in terms of exponential growth. And by the way, it might not be 25 million, it might be 100 million. It might be 1 billion. It could be a very, very long time. There is not a reasonable reason to believe that aliens would come and take the form of what we have. First of all, just think about transportation, okay? So, transportation is an enormous problem because going that distance is a horrendous issue, okay? So the fastest that we know of is the speed of light. Now you could argue that you could have some sort of quantum entanglement which could explain communication over those vast distances faster than the speed of light, right? That could be an interesting story to kind of help how they would communicate. You could have some sort of a wormhole sort of warp drive thing that would be created, which would help to get around these limitations, possible. But just think about it from a physical standpoint. Okay, so a person goes into a spacecraft. Now that spacecraft can be ripped apart, okay? That's not good. that's really quite problematic, right? That spacecraft might be in a situation where, the people inside could get destroyed by various different pressures. There's a lot of risks. Like, just imagine, you're going at, let's say that you could get going at 0.99 the speed of light. And, one little thing hits that spacecraft. What's it going to take to rip it apart? How many of those little things are there between here and your destination that you don't know about? Who knows? Who knows, right? Maybe it's mostly empty, etc., but it doesn't take much in order for the risk to become very catastrophic. So what if these beings were more like beings of light? They'd figured out some way to readjust themselves into photons and to travel very, very rapidly without all that risk. Interesting possibility. Whether it's the case, who knows? What if there's some sort of concept based on something like quantum entanglement that they could use? What if, so one of the things we did some experiments where we were able to exceed the speed of light for moving light. Okay, this was a number of years ago. I think they did 255 or 355 times the speed of light at transmitting. And of course, you can't transmit matter that far or that fast. But there's this concern of, okay, if you were to deconstruct it here and reassemble it there, that you may be transferring the information and not the person, right? So maybe you're killing this person over here, you're just duplicating them, right? Well, what's going on there? Maybe there's things they've thought of that go around that. And because of that, then what they've decided is that the nature of being their being, so they can live, virtually infinitely. They can live in maybe some sort of a collective quantum entangled state. They can travel, across the galaxy very, very quickly, etc., etc. Maybe all these things are something that they've discovered that we have no idea about at this point in time. We don't know. So I think the argument that there are no aliens, it could say, hey, look, we're self-terminating, or that we just simply never become interplanetary, and you have all these little micro civilizations existing on different planets that have reached some certain place where they find some stasis, and that's how they maintain themselves, and they no longer have, the ambition to go beyond that place. That's possible. Maybe they're all living in VR in those places, and so, they're exploring the universe in VR rather than live. Maybe that's possible. But the other thing is, it's possible that they are here, and they just don't take the shape that we think. Who knows? I'm definitely not saying that that is the case. Like I said, there's a reasonable probability, or possibility anyway, that we already live in some sort of a simulation. So anyway, I wanted to share those ideas just to give what is, in my opinion, a more optimistic take about the future of civilization. I don't think it's inevitable. I think it's, something that we have to be concerned about and we have to work on. But I do think that there are ways that technology can solve our issues and get us out of the predicament of self-termination that we are in, virtually inevitably, if we carry on in the direction we're going. And it will, the world, this to me is a very exciting time to be alive. Probably the most exciting period of time in history is right now. And, I'm going to be really excited to see what happens over the next 100 years. I hope that I live, and I hope that we find ways to extend our life. It's something that I'm super interested in, life extension technology, so that I can see what that evolution looks like. And it's possible that, we end up wiping ourselves out. And I don't think you can be naive in saying, hey, human ingenuity is just automatically going to solve it. I just do think that we can see technological paths that logically can lead us to a place where we can avoid the problems that would terminate us. And that's very helpful. And I think it doesn't require that we reduce our consumption drastically. In fact, I think that our quality of life in an abstract sense can continue to go up, that everyone in the world can, and that our global population can expand to 10 billion without that being, the end of the world. So, would love to hear what you guys think. I think it's a really interesting discussion. Maybe we can, set up a Zoom call or something for some people to discuss it who are interested. And we'll see when I decide to post this or where I decide to post it. But I wanted to share these ideas, and reach out to me. Let's have a conversation about what is a pretty fascinating topic.